Hello, and I want to thank you all for joining me today to discuss Tchaikovsky's Symphony Number 6, the Pathétique Symphony. Just to clear up some information about that name, I'm sure that to some of you that might look like pathetic, yeah, but just keep in mind that this is a French word, and it's passion. It really means passionate. That's what Tchaikovsky envisioned it to mean, and this title really came after his death and was attributed to publishers. So pathétique, I want you to think more about passion and deserving of empathy, maybe, rather than pathetic. Let's talk just a little bit about the composer himself. Peter Tchaikovsky. He was born in 1840 in Voltkinsk, Russia. He studied as a part of the inaugural class of the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And started there in 1861 and graduated in 1865. This was a formal institution that was more Western oriented, and this teaching made him a really different, unique composer in the area that he was in Russia. He had this ability to blend Western sounds that he had studied at the conservatory with the Russian styles that he grew up with and he knew about. In the book St. Petersburg by Simon Volkov, he identifies that Tchaikovsky believed that his training was quintessential to developing his own voice and to intertwining and creating musical dependence among these styles within his music. He wasn't someone who just wrote Russian music. He wasn't someone who just wrote outside of that Russian idiom. He's someone who blended it very well and uniquely, and that gives his music a unique sound. So it's important to recognize that he really was not a Russian nationalist composer by any stretch of the imagination. Tchaikovsky really rose to fame through his theatrical works, including the ballet Swan Lake and the opera Eugene Onegin. He became respected and revered as a symphonic composer by the time he premiered his Fourth Symphony. And really, through these theatrical works, he was able to gain some of that respect. Now, public life was not something that he was particularly fond of as a young composer. He did not embrace fame at all until he began conducting his own works. And he conducted the premieres of his Fifth and Sixth Symphonies and also conducted at the theater a lot. And this is really attributed to Tchaikovsky's scholar David Brown attributes this heightened anxiety and self-criticism that he had to why he fears this public eye so much. And it seems that he really only found reprieve from that fear in conducting. By the end of his life, he begins to find some comfort in the spotlight and becomes something of a public personality, a public persona. And this is strengthened in the public eye in 1884 when Tsar Alexander III, at that time the leader of Russia, confers upon him the Order of Saint Vladimir. And this allows him to have personal hereditary nobility, meaning himself and all of the people who follow in his lineage will be considered noble in the eyes of the Russian courts. This also gave him a pretty attentive audience in terms of the Tsar and being able to perform in front of the Tsar. And recently, sort of after he gets this title conferred upon him, he is asked by the Tsar to do a performance of Eugene Onegin, and he does, and it's hugely popular once again. So I want to share some quotes with you, talk about in just a moment, and I want to talk about how this symphony in particularly relates to his life, the place that it was in his life, and his death more pressing. So to those that are familiar with the Tchaikovsky symphonies, it really shouldn't come as any great surprise to learn that he struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his life. And this notion is really supported by his lengthy diaries and letters that he kept. And these really show a man in desolation, a man who is struggling to find his place in the world, and someone who was aware of beauty, aware of the presence of beauty around him, but really felt no way to contribute to that beauty except through music. And often felt that was even futile in his attempt to do that. clinical professor of psychiatry at Cornell Medical College, and also is the artistic director of Cornell Music and Medicine program. His name's Dr. Richard Koga. He says that Tchaikovsky really only had two ways of dealing with these feelings of sadness, and that was with alcoholism and composing. And this was after reading and researching tons of letters and diary entries to kind of get into his internal psyche. And these are two that he felt showcased that pretty well. The first one here is, in my life too, there are days, hours, weeks, and months in which everything looks black, when I am tormented by the thought that I am forsaken, that no one cares about me. Indeed, my life is of little worth to anyone. Were I to vanish from the face of the earth today, it would be no great loss to Russian music, and I would certainly cause no one great unhappiness. In short, I lived a selfish bachelor's life. I work for myself alone and care only for myself. This is certainly very comfortable, although dull, narrow, and lifeless. This is 7 years earlier, where he talks about the specific dissatisfaction in his life, and this is interesting here. I am sitting at the open window at 4 a.m. and breathing the lovely air of a spring morning. Life is still good, and it is still worth living on this May morning. I assert that life is beautiful in spite of everything. This everything includes the following items: illness. I am getting much too stout, and my nerves are all to pieces. The conservatory oppresses me to extinction. I am more and more convinced that I am absolutely unfitted to teach the theory of music. And 3, my pecuniary situation is very bad. That's financial. And 4, I am doubtful if Undine will ever be performed. I have heard that they are likely to throw me over. In a word, there are many thorns, but there are roses too. And that's an important line there. Many thorns, but there are roses too. He recognizes beauty. He recognizes the state of his life and the state of his mental capacity, but does not allow that to sort of discourage him. So the Sixth Symphony is a point of huge debate in terms of his death. The symphony premiered with the composer on the podium just 9 days before his death. And to some, this was just a huge coincidence, but to others, the dark funeral-like nature of the movement, particularly the first and last, are proof that Tchaikovsky knew of his own death, and even more scandalous, that he planned his own death. Now, these notions are largely unsupported, but with a few interesting points worth mentioning. Tchaikovsky was in St. Petersburg at the time of his death. His death is often attributed to cholera, and there was a cholera outbreak in St. Petersburg in 1893. However, there are reasons to believe that this story may not be true. Composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov stated that just after his death, "How strange! Tchaikovsky died from cholera, but access to his body was completely unobstructed." And so at this time, it was understood how cholera was transmitted, and they believed, people would get sick if they were close to others. But yet, Tchaikovsky dies with a reported 16 people around him, including brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews, who did not seem to be concerned with cholera. And then in 1981, just 40 years ago now, a report in the Washington Post identified that Tchaikovsky was asked to poison himself by an honor council made up of 8 men from the College of Law, and that this board was assembled based on a complaint lodged at Tchaikovsky by Duke Stenbach Thurmer, and that Tchaikovsky had persuaded his nephew to engage in a homosexual love affair. Of course, this isn't the first mention of Tchaikovsky's struggle with homosexuality, and many scholars accept that Tchaikovsky dealt with this same-sex attraction and believed it to be a sin and morally wrong. But much of the speculation comes from letters with his own nephew Modest, with whom he had a pretty strange relationship with. But this story comes from the widow of the Duke who lodged this complaint and raised this alarm. The widow, just before her death, decides to clear her consciousness, which is why this article ended up in the Washington Post, just 1981. So the official Russian government does not recognize that Tchaikovsky struggled with homosexuality, and they also reject any notion of a suicide death, of course. A big question in here is, how does Tchaikovsky create beauty in this piece, in The Thorns? So let's begin our work on this first movement. Tchaikovsky is known for his beautiful melodic content and for his general deformation of common forms with which he wrote in. This symphony is not an exception, and from the very beginning, the audience is exposed to the DNA of the piece through an opening bassoon solo written at pianissimo and supported only by an open fifth in the low strings. So like the opening of Beethoven 1, Tchaikovsky begins with an immediate focus on the sum dominant instead of the dominant preparation that we would expect from the slow introduction. It is only by measure 17 that one feels certain of the B minor tonality, and even then Tchaikovsky avoids putting the dominant in the bass voice, saving that for later, and he inverts the 5 chord to a first inversion. The composer's use of texture in this area also stands out, particularly the use of bassoon in the quiet dynamic at the beginning, and the use of the viola through the transition into the allegro at measure 19. Both of these instruments represent the outer edges of timbre within the orchestra. The bassoon sound is in the low register, and has a very distinct color to it, especially in this low register. And the viola has this nasal warm sound, and he uses both of these instruments, I believe, to produce a struggling or yearning effect through the tone, especially in this ritenuto that leads us to the allegro. In another breaking of tradition, Tchaikovsky immediately turns the listener to the primary theme of the movement. The use of do, re, mi, re at the very beginning in the felt key of E minor is the DNA for which the rest of the piece is built on. When the primary theme returns in the allegro, we see this increased sense of anxiety and movement, but that's not just in the tempo, it's also in the note relationships with each other. Short, short, long, short, right? To this theme of anxiety that we see here, presented by the violas at the beginning of the allegro. We really see an increased sense of energy and anxiety, this push and pull that the movement creates, a sort of sense of urgency and incongruence within the listener. And Tchaikovsky continues to play out with this quarter rest of silence throughout that gives the same effect. For around the next 80 measures, the composer plays with this theme, supporting it with a downward scalar motion, and he explores this theme, making it even more rambunctious, rhythmically complex, and sometimes even disappearing into the texture completely. Even more interestingly, we will never reach a cadence through this section or theme. It is always moving clearly past a moment where a cadence should be to start something completely new. So in this first rotation, we move towards the end of the primary theme. We transition out of this primary theme. The texture just starts to thin out. And we begin to find this medial caesura or caesura fill kind of moment between measures 80 and 88. He uses sequencing in the pedal point of A in the cello to encourage this modulation. As Tchaikovsky and Warren Darcy mention in their Elements of Sonata Theory book, sometimes in minor pieces that are working within the sonata form, these minor elements and major elements are working against each other as binary opposites. And this is really our first experience of this type as it moves into this transition. We really hear both B minor and D major at the same time. Not crazy, right? Because it's just a relative major-minor relationship, but this becomes even more important as we move through. The viola, again, is used by itself to connect these two sections. And then our true medial caesura of silence is found in measure 88 with this fermata quarter tone. Then we move into this hugely different secondary theme area. The secondary theme is a turning point for the listener in this piece. When you notice the disjunct nature of these two sections, one immediately finds confusion but peace in this theme. Of course, it's well within the realm of common practice to use a relative major key to establish the second theme. The change in texture, tempo, and dynamic from the first theme, though, provide a less resolute moment than where, if this were to just begin a piece, that would feel really different than it does here after this crazy introduction. Unbeknownst to the listener at the time, you're immediately introduced to the crux of the entire piece, major versus minor, or hope versus lack thereof. And even in this section of hope, we seem to maintain the level of anxiety to the listener throughout frequent tempo rubato, marked by the words incalzando. This literally translates to chasing, and it's a uniquely fitting word for this piece, as it's in these moments that we can feel the music yearning for something that it has not yet attained. Even in the major key, the nature of the music remains, dissatisfied with reality and interested in transformation. In another way, one can describe this section as harmonically static. Throughout this section, until the secondary theme, B, the second secondary theme, we really do not see much motion in the bass voices, and relatively few non-diatonic notes except for G sharp, just the 5 of 5, right? Or the third in the 5 of 5 chord here, an E major chord. So to support this further, almost every cadence in here features a fifth in the soprano voice instead of the tonic, and this weakens every single cadence. No cadence in here is a PAC. It withholds some form of justice to the listener's ear. So as we get into the secondary theme area, we notice there's a second theme in this secondary area. Kind of confusing to say that, sorry. But the presence of this second theme in the secondary area shows us that Tchaikovsky was trying to sort of work within a familiar scheme to him, and that's something that we call a trimodular block. And that's when an initial S theme, an initial secondary theme, functions as a sort of transition to a second S theme. This usually is a giveaway by the presence of two medial caesuras, and we have that here. This occurs essentially because the EEC, or the essential expositional cadence, is never released is never reached in the initial S theme. It falls away before we can ever get to that EEC. The first secondary theme functions as a transition and is unable to complete this given task. So this new secondary theme comes back. However, unlike the trimodular block described by Tchaikovsky and Darcy, this secondary theme also fails at providing the essential expositional cadence. And the first theme is brought back, except this time in 12/8. So the prescription of the trimodular block doesn't really hold. One can really conjecture on the presence of these two themes. To me, the first theme of this section maintains some of the original anxiety and hopelessness that Tchaikovsky expresses. It's surely more romantic, with this kind of longing built into it. While the second secondary theme, it really has more motion. And it starts on this sol and moves up to a do in a scalar fashion. And it seems just more confident, sure of itself, and just more harmonically stable. This doesn't really last at all, though. We see that the secondary theme, 1, returns. The first theme of the secondary area returns with some unique differences now. Primarily, the expanded instrumentation, the woodwinds, horns, and strings are now present in the accompaniment sound, although they're marked piano. The melody is now carried by firsts, seconds, and violas in octaves, and additionally, the accompaniment almost always rests on the downbeat, giving a sense of perpetual motion or floating within the sound. We find the essential expositional cadence in measure 142, but in an unconventional way. The soprano voice remains on the fifth of the chord, and tonic is noticeably missing from the downbeat and placed on the and of 1, weakening this cadence further. The fallout from the secondary theme reprise really functions as the closing section of the first rotation. The texture creeps away slowly, leading to just solo lines, repeating this melody until the bassoon solo, which is marked with the notorious 6 Ps. This leads us nicely into the beginning of the second rotation. And he once again comes back to using this idea of timbre, using strange, maybe some would consider non-soloistic instruments to mark huge melodic changes and push us to different areas. So this second rotation, we hear a really rhythmically active chromatic passage that functions as a transition back into this primary theme. And during this transition, the entire orchestra is heard in one way or another. The section can really be quite a scare for an audience member new to this piece. Just a few bars into this rotation, we hear the P theme material again in the violin voice, placed low in the register and marked by fortissimo. This melody is immediately heard with more intensity and energy than before. The way this material is used is largely more related to the beginning bassoon solo than the presentation of the melody at the opening allegro. This is really because of the sequencing that is used and the developmental sort of feel that we get. The background of this section is dominated by descending scalar passages that lead to the sequencing of the melodic content. The scalar sound moves into the foreground at measure 190 with the trumpet part. So the primary theme continues here, and we begin to break into the transition out of this primary theme. And Tchaikovsky uses a super prolonged dominant F-sharp pedal that it begins in measure 267. And this is a technique that you'd probably associate more with Brahms, who Tchaikovsky didn't particularly care for as a composer. But certainly he would have been aware of and at least a little bit studied on his work, so it's curious. This dominant pedal carries us through the transition and into the closing of the first theme. Another unique feature of this moment here is Tchaikovsky's changing of the felt harmonic rhythm. Throughout this symphony, and particularly since the beginning of the first rotation, the harmonic rhythm has been quite speedy. So this use of the pedal and then the illusion of halftime through the notation that I've included here really create an energizing place to be, a place that has less motion, but almost this bubbling up. So we get into this secondary theme now, and the choice of key seems important. There's a small caesura that breaks it, and then we're instantly in this key of B major. The F sharp pedal is not resolved until beat 3, really, and not super comfortably until the downbeat. But this choice of key is really interesting because we see that the binary roles that major and minor play in the symphony can go even farther than just relative. That this is a more stark contrast between B minor and B major. I feel part of the second rotation is this is just more rattling, I guess, movement. Instead of this major 1 to 3, we now get a minor 1 to major 1. So he does sort of weaken the return of the secondary theme slightly, only by placing the melody in 2 octaves instead of 3, and leaving the violas to accompany this time. This is resolved in 2 ways. He uses quick leaps up and down, or up through the octaves in the melody, and by building tension and excitement through rubato. This theme comes to the same demise, though, as it did previously, and is really unable to cadence successfully. So that takes us into this closing zone, which begins at measure 317, with the indication of tempo 1. He uses again chromatic motion to lead us towards a never arriving cadence. The clarinet solo leads us into the ending of the closing and repeats the material from the secondary area, failing to cadence each time. So as the coda begins, we can hear descending B major scales with the higher tonic always present on beat 2. There's a lonely, melancholy feeling throughout here with no sense of justice or accomplishment, just a true sense of being finished, at least for now. So the 2 ways to really understand this form are to conceptualize it as a sonata form with a truncated recapitulation, or to use Tchaikovsky and Darcy's idea of a type 2 sonata form. Both ideas have some level of truth or usability in them. You'll see mine here is expressed in the type 2 sonata form. In its truest sense, though, this is a sonata form. There is a slow introduction and exposition with 3 themes instead of 2 and 2 key areas, a development and a recapitulation which does not include the primary theme. However, Tchaikovsky's submission of the type 2 sonata form makes a little more sense given the primary theme does not technically return. It just returns in the development naturally, so it doesn't fit perfectly into this box. But if anyone knows anything about Tchaikovsky, he didn't concern himself much with form. His concern was much more of a teleological outcome of the pieces he was writing. So of course he was familiar and understood the forms of the great composers before him, but he chose to deform around this in his own creations of melody and discourse. So one could make any number of ideas up about what the true programmatic nature of this piece is. Did Tchaikovsky see his own death before it happened? Was he asked to kill himself by the Russian elites? We really won't ever know the answers to these questions. However, this piece may find some relief to the depressed or anxious mind. Relief that is possible to express the emotions that they feel. Or perhaps the comfort of knowing that we're not alone in our desolation or our strife. That if someone as great, gifted, and successful as Tchaikovsky can succumb to depression and anxiety, surely anyone can. So the piece provides me much comfort that the existence around us, often bleak and painful, but we're capable of creating beauty within it. In a word, as Tchaikovsky said, there are many thorns, but there are roses too.